Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to the View Up Air. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is May 9th, 2018. Considering the lack of reporting by the corporate media on the state of civil liberties in Canada, you'd think things are quite all right, but that would be an assumption, a carefully crafted one. If you remember back before sunny days, when the Liberals said they would fix the problematic elements of Harper's anti-terrorism bill C-51. Oh, almost 3 years in, the replacement C-59 is crawling its way through Parliament, doing exactly what the process for C-51 was. Ignoring evidence, voting down common sense amendments, not listening to testimony or case study from around the world where this game's been played before. But Minister of Public Safety Ralph Goodale says all is well. Yeah. It's not. Hassan Diab is a Canadian citizen, professor, husband, and father. He spent the last decade being the subject of a wild goose chase by the French government for a terror attack decades ago. He spent 38 months of near solitary confinement in a French prison without being charged with a single thing. This year, a French judge finally threw the case out and ordered Diab returned to his family in Canada. But how could this happen? Where would such falsely incriminating evidence come from? Why would it waste a decade of his life? Well, according to very recently unearthed evidence through a Freedom of Information request, you have to ask the Canadian Department of Justice those questions. Seems they were the ones who lied, obstructed, and denied the rights of Hassan Diab and extradited him to France. Keep in mind, this was under the previous government. Surprise, surprise. RightsCon is coming to Toronto in a week from today. Over 2,000 participants from more than 140 countries, delivering nearly 300 sessions with participation from over 700 governments, NGOs, corporations, startups, media, you name it, everything about what is coming for rights, technology, connectivity, and the risks involved. Now, the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, ICLMG, will be part of RightsCon. And National Coordinator for ICLMG, Tim McSorley, returns tonight to discuss RightsCon, the Diab travesty, and his recent days of live tweeting C-59 through committee, and what the ICLMG has to say about it at this stage of the game. That's what we're going to cover tonight. It's probably going to be a little shorter show tonight. I talked to Tim yesterday we put down this segment and we talk about those three main issues. Here it is. And we welcome back to the View Up here once again the National Coordinator for the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, Tim McSorley. Welcome, sir.
Hi, Glenn. How are you?
Good, good. It's good to have you back. Now, I, for one, am very familiar with what ICLMG does, and I thank you guys for it. But how could you give a condensed version of the mission? Because more people need to know about the ICLMG.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, it's great to always get the word out there about the work we're doing. We're a coalition of about 45 organizations from across Canada, and our goal is really to defend civil liberties from the impact of national security laws and the so-called war on terror. We started back in 2002, right after the first Canada adopted its first anti-terrorism act following the attacks on September 11, 2001. And really we came together because people saw the writing on the wall that national security laws and the rhetoric coming out of the Bush administration at the time and also from the Canadian government really showed how national security laws weren't going to be framed as, just protecting people based on our civil liberties, but really were being framed as demonizing certain communities, most especially Muslim and Arab communities, but also from experience and seeing in other countries that these laws often get used to stifle civil liberties, that they're used across sectors, that when one sector is under attack, often other sectors come under attack as well. And people want to be able to monitor it essentially and make sure that there were groups following it. And so that's how we came to be. We're a small shop. We're just two people, and we mostly do research and education work. So, for example, putting together videos, briefs, backgrounders, stuff for organizations to use and for politicians to use and to influence politicians, but also kind of popular education stuff to try to explain to the public a little bit more about how national security laws that are often secret and vague and really unclear as to how it can affect you in your everyday life, why we need to be concerned about them and try to help raise the alarm around that. So that's the work that we do. And if people are interested, they can find it all at iclmg.ca. And we're nonpartisan. We're not funded by any government agencies or funding. We're funded mostly about 95% through our members, and then and the public, and a little bit through different foundations. But really, we make sure that we're as independent as we can be.
Absolutely, and it's obvious in the work you do because it's just purely objective. And what I like about the work that ICLMG does is there are some out there that do very detailed and accurate reporting of national security issues, but it's very shop talk. Mm-hmm. And I've noticed that ICLMG can explain things to the average citizen so they get it. And I think that's a very important part of what you guys do. But it's also the access that you guys get yourself where you need to be. I know that C59 has been a focus of your group for quite a while, and I think you could probably speak to that better than anybody, considering what you've gone through in the last few weeks regarding keeping track of C59's snail progress through Parliament.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's been a long kind of process, and yeah, that's part of the reason why we're based in Ottawa, and the reason for that is that we can sit through committee meetings and meet with MPs, and there's a whole group of really also really great kind of progressive lawyers and legal analysts based in Ottawa who can help give us kind of their own analysis of what these laws mean. And then we kind of work on putting it together and trying to make it accessible. But on C59 especially, there's a lot to talk about, and the media coverage has just been, there's been very little, especially given what we see in Bill C59 and the impact it's going to have on Canadian laws and national security in the country.
Well, I mean, we heard even back on the campaign trail about the problematic aspects of C-51 that Trudeau promised to fix. C-59 is the response to that, but I haven't seen anybody outside of the Liberal government who says this fixes C-51. There are obvious problems. I know that you guys have documented them to great length, but I wanted to refer to a civil society statement about Bill C-59. Came out in April of this year. It was, oh my goodness, it's signed by so many organizations, over 40, I believe. And
yeah,
it's a pretty encompassing group of people who know what they're talking about. And Bill C-59 is no fix by any means, is it?
No, it's not. And really, it was a cynical deal at the time when the Liberals said back in 2015, when they were in opposition, that they would vote in favor of C-51, so they couldn't be pigeonholed as being weak on national security. But trust us, when you vote for us and we get elected and we ride into Ottawa with holding the charter above our heads, we'll make sure that we fix the problematic aspects of C-51, and they just haven't. There's cosmetic changes, there's superficial changes to it. Probably the most substantial change is, on some of the review and oversight. But any changes, and you could have the best review and oversight in the world, but if you have the kinds of laws that were brought in with C-51 and the ones that they're proposing to bring in with C-59, no degree of review and oversight is going to fix that and protect us from the overreach. So it's really, there's been a lot of rhetoric about openness and willingness to consult. And that's part of the reason it's taken so long, is that they have gone through these motions of consultation, but really what we have in the end is a bill that maintains and just tries to, kind of pretty up some of the worst aspects of C-51, and leave the rest of it as is.
Well, there are a lot of issues, but there were three that were specifically stated in the civil society statement. And the first one that, how many Canadians on the street know this is in this bill. C-59 authorizes mass surveillance. It is very similar in effect to the Patriot Act in the United States, from what I can see. Now, there will be a creation of the National Security Intelligence Review Agency and an intelligence commissioner. Well, so? Every other members of Five Eyes already has this.
Yeah, and in fact, these are agencies that we've had in a certain form already, too. So the National Security Intelligence Review Agency, it's a step in the right direction. Right now we have 3 different review agencies for 3 different national security agencies. So for CSIS, the CSE, which kind of does foreign surveillance, yeah, and the RCMP, and they all work separately, which is a problem. So the NSIRA, this new review agency, will bring them all together under one umbrella and give them kind of an overarching review power, which is good. But we've already seen they're based heavily on the current CSIS review agency, and we could have a whole conversation just about the problems with that. But yeah, suffice to say that, even though it's a step in the right direction, without giving it the resources and the power to do more than what we can currently do, we're concerned that it won't actually have any teeth. And then for the Intelligence Commissioner, it's basically taking parts of the current CSE Commissioner who reviews what's going on there with foreign surveillance. It does give a new oversight power, so that for the first time, they'll be able to actually approve surveillance authorizations before either CSIS or the CSE can carry them out. But it's done in secret. It's not an actual judge. It's a retired judge who will be appointed to the position, and they're appointed by the Prime Minister. It's only a part-time position for a job that really should be full-time, probably even more than full-time, to be honest. Yeah. And the big concern is that the approvals will still, even though there has to be public reporting, they're still done in secret. And so what we've seen in the United States is, for example, with the FISA courts, where they authorize foreign surveillance, and it's done in secret, it essentially became a rubber stamp. Yeah. And that's our concern right now, is that these review agencies, instead of actually making sure and limiting this kind of national security overreach, will actually serve to rubber stamp it. So will allow the government to say, well, we have review agencies, they've approved these authorizations, but really what they're approving are authorizations based on laws that we shouldn't have in the first place.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's something that I've noticed with some of the cases in the U.S. through FISA court. The court is very limited on what it can do and what it can say about anything it's presented. It's just, here's our case, up or down. And it comes down to that. And once the government knows how to play the game, well, guess what, right? They're going to win every time. And it's all in secret. And exactly. I don't think Canada has to go down that road. The no-fly list. This was a huge issue with C-51. I understood it. It made sense. I mean, everybody has seen the odd story about an Arab or a first-generation Canadian with an Arabic name who's 8 or 9 years old that's on a no-fly list. And there's absolutely no way to correct this. The Liberals say they're fixing it with C-59, but are they?
Well, again, the no-fly list, there's a lot of rhetoric around it. So there's two things for the no-fly list. One is what we kind of call the slow-fly list, and which is the people who are essentially false positive. They share a name with a name that's on the list, and they get held up. They may get, interrogated, and it's a real problem. But they're not actually the people on the list. And there's nothing to help to make sure that if you're, 9-year-old Adam Ahmed, which is an actual name on the list, there's nothing to guarantee that you're not going to be stopped every time you try to fly in or out of Canada and questioned, even though you're not the Adam Ahmed on that list. So that's one thing. And the government has said that has put funding in to bring in a redress system. But it's been 10 years. They're saying it's going to take another at least 3 years to bring in a redress system. We're very skeptical that they're actually going to, in a timely manner, bring in a real redress system that will be effective. So that's one part of it. And then the other part is if you're actually the person who's on the list. So let's say, for example, you're Adam Ahmed, who, for whatever reason, the government has decided to put you on the list. You won't be notified that you're on the list until you go to take a flight and you're stopped from taking a flight. You may never know, because unless they actually stop you from boarding a plane, and this is something a lot of people don't know, is that if you're on the no-fly list, it's up to the government's discretion to stop you from boarding the plane. So you might be able to fly no problem sometimes, and then other times you're interrogated, and then other times you may actually be stopped from flying. But you don't know if you're on the list until they actually stop you and you receive an official letter saying that you were stopped from flying because of the no-fly list. And then there's a whole secretive process to then try to get yourself off the no-fly list, where you don't have access to the information used against you to keep you on the list. You get a summary, but not the actual evidence. It's not a criminal court, so they can use secret intelligence information that wouldn't hold up in a court of law in order to justify you being on the list. So you may never actually be able to get off the list or even know why you're on it in the first place. And the kicker in all this is that we don't know how many people are on the list, and we've never actually seen a report on the no-fly list being effective. And the government says it's because it's too secret, but our sense is that the reason we've never seen anything about the effectiveness of the list is that it actually can't be proven to be effective, and that's why we've always just called for it to be abolished. And that's what we're still arguing for at the ICLMG, is that, there's other tools that we have to keep people who pose a danger to others from boarding a plane or from traveling, that we don't need secretive anti-terrorism, national security legislation to do it, but rather if someone poses a threat, get the evidence, charge them in court, and then let it play out in open court and not through these secret no-fly lists and other, there's a terrorist entities list and everything like that too, and they're all based on secret information that can't be accessed by the person being investigated.
Would you have any idea offhand how much money it costs a year for this no-fly regime?
That's a good question. I don't actually know. I'm not sure if those specific numbers have ever been published, but it's interesting. I should try to look that up and see if we can find how much it costs to maintain the no-fly list and the whole system. And that's actually been a point of contention around the redress system, is that when the Conservatives brought in the no-fly list, because this wasn't part of the original Anti-Terrorism Act that the Liberals brought in back in 2002, this was gradually brought in over time and really in its current form done under Bill C-51. But they didn't bring in a redress system, and the Liberals have actually argued that that's why it's so hard to bring in, because it will be incredibly costly now to bring in a redress system, because the current system is set up so badly that it's going to take a lot to try to actually figure out how to fix it. And so so we don't actually know how much it costs right now, but what we're being told is that it's going to cost a lot to actually fix this program, which again, I think is a reason why we should, really be considering just abolishing it and, focusing on other ways that we can keep airline passengers safe. And of course, there's the age-old question of why is somebody too, dangerous to travel by plane, but they're not too dangerous to get on a bus, to get on a train, and it's not that we want people banned from taking other modes of transportation, but it seems like a knee-jerk reaction based on the fears of September 11th, and that we're going to keep seeing that and not actually on what constitutes an actual threat to people in Canada.
That also sounds to me like a little bit of a backhand admission that the Department of Public Safety has their own Phoenix system.
Yeah. No, that's a good way to put it.
Now, the thing that really caught my attention and my disdain about C-59 was the changes to the CSE, basically legalizing them to do offensive cyber operations. Is this one of the things that is just being codified? It's being legalized, or are they actually getting a big increase in capability?
This is a big increase in capability.
Okay.
So up until now, so the CSE is really interesting because it's one of the longest standing national security agencies in Canada. It was set up during World War II.
Yeah.
But very few people actually know that it exists or be able to tell you what it is. It doesn't have the same kind of name recognition as like the National Security Agency in the United States or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And it was only in the last 20 years actually put into law that the CSE existed.
Yes.
Up until then, it existed, but it wasn't codified anywhere. And so with C-59, they're taking that a step further and actually creating the CSE Act. So it will actually exist as its own piece of legislation, which is kind of mind-boggling for such a large institution that conducts such important work that we're only seeing them enacted in their own act, some 70 years after they were created. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, is this similar to when MI6 finally came out public in Britain?
I guess it would be similar to that. I'd probably MI6 is even a bigger, just because the UK's surveillance apparatus is that much larger than Canada's. But I'd say it's comparable in terms of what we have in Canada versus what they have in the UK. Yeah. Up until recently, the CSC was really focused on surveillance and protecting Canada's cyber infrastructure. That was, that was their bread and butter. They had 3 points that they could do. It was foreign surveillance, it was supporting CSIS and the RCMP in their work, and protecting Canada's cybersecurity. These new offensive and defensive cyber powers are completely new. There is a possibility, and we wouldn't be surprised, if they were already engaging in these in some way or another, and we just simply didn't realize what they were doing, because as part of their work already in terms of foreign surveillance, they did have the power to, for example, use malware to gain access to a network, things like that, where that was already kind of bordering on whether or not it's an actual, offensive activity that supports their surveillance activities.
Yeah.
But this really puts into law that they'll be able to carry out offensive cyber operations. So essentially, if they think that, the example they keep bringing out is that if they think that China is going to launch that Chinese hackers are going to launch a cyber attack on Canada, then Canada should be able to, if we know it's going to happen, act first, and citing that, the adage of the best defense is a good offense. So that's completely new in this bill.
This is a new and dangerous road to go down for Canada as a whole, is it not? Because when you start engaging in state-sponsored cyber activity, this is a whole new game. And, maybe it's just my opinion, but when it comes down to it, if there's one target that somebody wants to get out there, it's probably going to be 2 or 3 people under the age of 30, and they could be anywhere on the globe. So, is this just going to turn into a big political tool, I guess is what I'm asking.
It has the possibility to. They've tried to work in some checks and balances where it has to be approved by the Foreign Affairs, by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And just to clarify that the CSE falls under the Minister of National Defense, yes. Whereas, for example, CSIS is under Public Safety. So it is already under the purview of the military. But really, I think you put it well when you said that it brings us into this realm of state-sponsored cyber activities and the idea of state-sponsored hacking. And our concern is that there's some limitations, but there's not enough limitations. We're not clear enough yet on what the CSE will be involved in, what kind of tools they'll be using. They have limitations saying that they can't engage anything that would pervert democracy or justice, but democracy isn't defined in the bill, so we're not sure, just as one person's protest is another person's, yep. Radical environmental terrorist, yep. What is considered a democratic process and what isn't. And they also can't engage in bodily harm, anything that would lead to bodily harm, which is good. But it leaves it wide open for so many other things. And we're kind of at this cusp right now where we're seeing different countries engaging in a lot of rhetoric. And for sure, it's kind of I'd say a dangerous situation out there right now in terms of what's going on with cyber warfare, with new tools that are being developed by all kinds of different actors and countries. Yeah. But if we look historically, when we've seen these new kinds of arms being developed, and that's what these are, there's 2 paths that we can take. One is that you provoke and you develop your own arms. So I have the bigger, you have a sword, I'll have a bigger sword. But all we end up in is basically people developing stronger and stronger weapons that put everyone at more risk. Versus, do we take a considered, careful approach and say, well, no, we don't want to see an international sphere where people are simply trying to develop more and more hacking tools, more and more ways to get backdoors into encryption, more and more ways to break into, cyber networks. Yeah. Or do we step back and say, let's figure out and push on the international stage ways to limit the development of these tools and ways to actually protect privacy and protect cyber networks that really are essential. And that's what we're worried we're losing, with this new mandate of the CSE and with very little debate and very little clarity about what they'll be doing, that we're simply feeding into this kind of rush to develop bigger and better cyber hacking tools than we've had in the past.
Those are the 3 main issues that were covered in the civil society statement, but I know you have more specific issues with C-59.
Yeah, there's a lot more. Those are the 3 that we could fit in the statement. There's maybe 2 others I'd really want to touch on. One is this idea of threat disruption powers that are really concerning to us. And that's under C-51. CSIS was granted these new powers to engage in what they're calling threat disruption activities. And it's important, I guess, to understand a bit of the history of CSIS. Back before 1984, the RCMP conducted both law enforcement, but also they had the RCMP Security Service, and they engaged in basically secret policing and national security work, and would do their own surveillance and intelligence gathering and things like that. And what ended up happening was that they were doing so many things in secret, and there was such a blurring of the line between what they were doing as a law enforcement agency and what they were doing as a surveillance agency. There were quite a few scandals, especially towards their activities in regard to political activists across the country, and especially Quebec sovereignty activists, with the most notable one being when they burnt down a barn because they suspected that the FLQ and the Black Panthers were going to be having a meeting there. So in order to block the meeting, they actually burnt down the building they were going to meet in. Thank God no one was in there. So those scandals came out, and they created the McDonald Commission, and they decided, look, we need to separate secret policing and national security work, especially the surveillance stuff, from the RCMP. And so they split off the RCMP security service, closed it down, and created CSIS. And their job since '84 has really been just to conduct surveillance activities. And now in 2015, they're granted these new powers to conduct these threat reduction activities, which is actually going out and undertaking activities to try to undermine people they see as a threat. But people who haven't been charged with a crime, they're not charging these people. They're not a law enforcement agency, so they're not taking this to court after the fact. Essentially, they're empowered to carry out some acts on their own. Some acts they would require a warrant for. But even with a warrant, they wouldn't be challenged in court by a defense attorney or by anybody else. It's just them in front of a judge. And then they carry out those activities in secret. And we may never know what they're carrying out. And somebody who we work with kind of framed it in an interesting way. He said, it doesn't give them the power to engage in the barn burning, that the RCMP did back in the 70s. But you could look at it in terms of as a kind of digital barn burning, where they are given the powers to, use malware to take down websites, to intercept email messages and change their contents or simply make them disappear. They would have the ability to break into somebody's apartment and change out equipment and things like that to limit the movement of someone. So if it could be that all of a sudden you get to the airport and your plane tickets have been canceled and you don't know why, and that could be CSIS. So things like that, and it would never be challenged in court. We have enough problems with the RCMP and what they do in their national security work, but at least eventually, in theory, they lay charges against someone, it goes to court, and then their warrants and their activities can be challenged, and if it's unconstitutional and violated a charter right, it's thrown out, and the person is depending on the severity, either released or that evidence is thrown out of court. But this may never go to court. This doesn't have to be, it would never be challenged in open court or by a defense attorney. And so that's really incredibly concerning to us. And the Liberals have brought in some new restrictions and different wording around how the warrants can be issued and around the list of what particular activities CSIS can carry out. And arguably, they've actually made it constitutional now, because a big argument for C-51 was that these powers were actually unconstitutional and wouldn't stand up if anybody ever took it to court. Yeah. But part of this question is that there's one thing about making something constitutional and that wouldn't fall down in court. And there's another thing about whether or not we should just be doing it. And, we still have questions about the constitutionality of it. But really the question is, should we be giving these kinds of powers to an agency that operates in secret? And we just believe, that if it was presented this way clearly to the public, and we've been trying to do, the answer would be no. But because it's wrapped up with a lot of other issues, because the original bill was wrapped up in the rhetoric of just after the attack on Parliament Hill, there hasn't been, it's been incredibly difficult to actually get a clear, honest debate out in the public about any, the specific aspects of either C-51 or C-59.
And again, that just reminded me, I mean, I think this is your third appearance on the show now. I've done other national security episodes. And the thing that always gets me is it goes right back to the definitions of their key terms. There simply are no definitions. What the hell is a disruptive activity? That could be anything under the sun.
Yeah, and they've brought in a list of what, those can include. But really, it is incredibly broad, and the list that they've brought in is still very broad. the argument is that in theory, anything that's below what they need a warrant for is also still possible. So we just don't know what they're going to be doing. And you could have the most restricted list in the world, but the question is, should a national security organization that operates in secret be carrying out these real world disruption activities? Or should they be, making sure that the information that they collect is strong enough to form a criminal case and then pass it off to the RCMP as a law enforcement agency who can get warrants, and then they'll be challenged in court. And really, for us, for all the problems that we have, with law enforcement and the criminal code already, that would be still be the much better possibility than having this kind of secret disruption powers.
I agree with that. Now, at the end of April, you put in considerable time to sit through the committee on C-59 at CSIS, Public Safety and National Security Committee. They did their clause-by-clause meetings. I bet you weren't really surprised when it was all said and done.
No, we wanted to sit through it so that we'd be able to document, what was happening and really kind of be able to, because it can be hard after the fact to actually know what happened.
Yeah.
But really, we weren't surprised with the result. And really, it just kind of went again to show the fact that the rhetoric around openness and willingness to collaborate on this bill was really just that. It was rhetoric. Because basically what we saw was that throughout, I'm trying to think of how, usually clause by clause is done in about 2 hours, maybe 4 hours. This clause by clause, I think, took upwards of 15 hours. And it's because there were over 100 amendments brought by the opposition parties, most of them through the really strong diligence by the New Democratic Party, to bring amendments that reflected the major concerns that us and groups like Amnesty International Canada and the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and the National Council of Canadian Muslims and so many other organizations brought forward. And they brought the motions to make amendments to improve this bill and answer those concerns. And one by one, they were voted down. And so in the end, there were only 4 out of over 100 opposition motions that were adopted. Essentially, they were adopted, and it's not to disparage the work of those opposition members who brought it, but they were adopted because they either reflected the other amendments that the Liberals were going to bring anyways, and so they were fine voting for it. Or essentially in committee, they were told, well, it won't have an impact and won't make a difference in how we do the work anyway, so there's no harm in, adopting this amendment. And there was even one instance where a motion was moved by the NDP that was amended to such a degree by the Liberals on the committee that the NDP in the end didn't even vote in favor of their amendment because of the amendments to that the Liberals brought. So it's an NDP motion that ended up passing, but was so changed from the original motion that the NDP in the end didn't vote for it themselves. So that's kind of the level of openness that we saw at the committee, even after dozens of hours of testimony and appearances by civil liberties and human rights organizations from across the country during their study of the bill, and after all those hours of clause by clause. What we see is essentially the same bill coming out as went in.
So with all this standard Liberal boilerplate now of consultation and listening, et cetera, they're putting in the time. They're just not listening. Because when you told that little story there, that was something I was going to ask. This is a traditional House of Commons committee. The Liberals have a majority. And that's the end of the story at the end of the day, is it not? It is, but it's a little bit more than that at this point, because this is getting into weeds maybe a little bit, but usually a bill will come before the House of Commons. It'll go through first reading and then go through second reading where substantial changes can be made, and then it's sent to the committee. Mm-hmm. And then at committee, they're more limited in the scope of amendments that they can bring. You can't bring major changes to the bill. You have to follow the intent of the bill
your amendments have to follow the intent of the bill once it goes to committee if it's after second reading. In this case, the government made a lot of fanfare and much ado about the fact that they were sending it to committee before second reading, so that at committee they would be able to bring that there would be a possibility of much larger amendments being brought to the bill, more substantial amendments to be brought to the bill. And so, in theory, what they were signaling, or not in theory, what they were signaling was that they were open to broad amendments and big amendments being brought to Bill C-59. But then, and then it gets back to what you were saying, though, that in the end they just followed the regular committee, way of operation, where the party that has a majority on the committee, it was the same thing with the Conservatives before, and it's the same thing with the Liberals now, essentially make sure that the amendments that the governing party wants to see made are the ones that go through, and others don't. I don't want to talk too long right now, but there's actually another interesting part to the bill where the Liberals actually use that to bring a whole new act, create a whole new act that they embedded into Bill C-59. That if we have a minute, I'd be interested in kind of talking about, because it's we're sure it's going to come back up as one of the justifications for how much better Bill C-59 is, but it's really not as good as the Liberals will try to make it out to be.
Sure, go ahead if it's going to be coming up. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what they did was they actually took the opportunity of being at committee and this different form of committee to bring an act that they're calling something along the lines of the Mistreatment by Foreign Entities Act. And so essentially Canada has rules around how our national security agencies are allowed to use information that either comes from torture or information that they share that could lead to torture. So for example, if there's a regime that we know that engages in torture, then Canadian national security agencies are supposed to be limited in how they can use that information. And it's a way to make sure that we're not engaging in basically this marketplace of torture where we'll just use any information, even if it's based on torture, and thereby legitimate, the torture and mistreatment that's carried out by other countries. Mm-hmm. And likewise, they're not supposed to share information with a regime if we think it will lead to them engaging in torture, which is something that we've seen in the past. So, for example, information that was shared with Syria led to the torture of Maher Arar.
Yes.
Well, actually, information that was shared with the United States, who then rendered Maher Arar to Syria, and then, and he was tortured there. And so that we have these rules, but they're essentially, unless the government decides to make them public, they're made in private. They're made in secret, and we never know what the rules are. The Liberals brought a whole new act that they say enshrines these rules against torture into law, saying that we can't use information tied to torture, but it actually doesn't do that. It's an act that mandates the government to have these rules and to make them public, but doesn't say what needs to be in the rules. So you have directives like the Conservatives had before. They were weaker directives that essentially had plenty of exceptions that would allow a national security agency to either use information that they believe came from mistreatment or torture, or share information that could lead to mistreatment of torture. The only difference is that now we'll know that the rules have changed and what rules are on the books, but there's nothing actually limiting it. But when it was introduced at committee, it was held up as being, a commitment to ensure that our national security agencies aren't complicit in torture in other countries based on either using or sharing information. And the Conservatives critiqued it at committee, saying, well, what about exigent circumstances if, a life is at risk and we need to use that information and it came from torture, but, someone's at risk, we can't vote for this because we need to have those exceptions. And the Liberals actually said, well, we're against torture. But if you look at the bill and the current directives that are in place, it actually has those exceptions for exigent circumstances, that if a life is threatened.
I thought they did, yeah.
Those exceptions are still there. So you have this argument at committee about, putting too many restrictions on national security agencies and saying, no, we're standing up to protect against torture, when really the act that's being brought in doesn't go so far as to actually protect against the use of information that could lead to torture or that's derived from torture. So, it's that kind of thing where it is a step in the right direction that these rules will be public, so at least we can critique, and a government that would weaken these rules, and we know what they are. But really, as we've seen with a majority government, either under the Conservatives or with the Liberals, if they believe that it's what needs to be there, they'll leave it in place and they won't change it. And so unless it's a firm commitment enshrined in law, then there can be transparency, but again, that doesn't make up for rules that can lead to torture or mistreatment.
No, I think this is a problem that's been in the Canadian system since the Honourable Anne McClellan in 2002. It's never been addressed. There's been more than enough cases of malfeasance, and that pretty much brings us right into the case of Hassan Diab.
Mm-hmm.
Hassan Diab's a Canadian citizen, a professor, a husband, a father. He's spent over the last decade being the subject of a wild goose chase by France for a terror attack in the 80s. He was extradited from Canada, spent 38 months of near solitary confinement in a French prison without being charged with anything. And this year, a French judge finally threw the case out and ordered him returned to his family in Canada. And, the immediate thing is you say, well, how could this happen? Well, we found out how this happened and who was directly responsible, Tim?
Well, again, we see Canadian complicity. So there was a French government that wanted Hassan Diab extradited. But what's recently come out through new documents given to the CBC was that a Justice Department official, a Canadian Justice Department official, basically worked with the French government as their case was falling apart. The French case was based heavily on handwriting experts and handwriting evidence that was just totally flawed, and that some of it was even shown was even things that Hassan Diab had written. It was his now ex-wife had written those things, and that was the handwriting they were comparing. It was a mess, and that information was being discredited. And the Justice Department official coordinated with the French government, telling them you need to find a third handwriting expert because these two aren't going to pass muster, and then proceeded to delay and ask for adjournments in court, claiming that there needed to be more time for new evidence that the French government was working on, and denied that he knew what it was that the French government was working on, all the while that he was directing the French government on how to shore up their case. So it's really just, there are provisions in the law that, that alone is kind of eyebrow raising, that in extradition cases, it's typical that Justice Department officials work with the extraditing government in order to help them with their case. But I think it's framed in the law as cooperation, and definitely not in actually directing them in how they can strengthen their case. And that's just one part of it. The other concerning part of it is that the same person from the Justice Department told the French government that if you can send a fingerprint over, we'll have our experts analyze the fingerprint, and if we get a fingerprint to match, then for sure, it'll strengthen your case and it'll go a long way to helping you ensure that Hassan Diab is extradited. So they sent the information over. It was analyzed, if I understand correctly, by the RCMP. It was found not to match Hassan Diab, but then the justice official did not divulge that to the court or to Hassan's defense. So they had exculpatory evidence showing that these fingerprints did not match Hassan Diab, and they withheld it from both the court and the defense, while all the while helping the French government, buy time to find this third handwriting expert. So it's just a complete. Really, every time I explain this, I just feel this like disgust and contempt for the fact that the case and the presiding judge on the extradition case was already saying that, this evidence wouldn't hold up in court in Canada. It was shown that there was evidence that came from unsourced evidence that could have been derived from torture that we just don't know where it came from. And all the while, the Justice Department was complicit in making sure that Hassan Diab was extradited to France.
It seems like this breaks about as many rules as a Canadian citizen would think that their own federal government would do to ensure that they came first. But this is the exact opposite. This is a frame-up, and it took a French judge finally to say, this is ridiculous, you've got nothing. The other thing that really, I don't know how people can deny it anymore, but just by coincidence, we have this case of Hassan Diab. We have the case of Maher Arar. We have the case of Abu Sufyan Abdul Razak. We have Abdullah al-Malki, Ahmed al-Ma'ati, Muayyad Nureddin. These are all Canadian citizens who have been removed from Canada, and it turns out, they're not the right people. Mm-hmm. How much longer can this go on before something's really done about this? There's been reports, there's been commissions, there's been this, there's been that. No government seems to be willing to fix this. Do you think it's a case because there's just too much dirty laundry, or are they really not interested in fixing it?
I think it's a few different things. I think that there's still just intense Islamophobia that's often provoked by politicians who take that fear and use it to their advantage. It's a cynical view, but it exists. I also think that there is this intense fear by each government that they need to do everything they can so that there isn't some kind of terrorism attack on their watch, and so they're willing to maintain these rules that clearly target Muslim and Arab men in particular, but Muslim and Arab communities in Canada in general, and also are used against, Black Canadians and against First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. They're willing to essentially sacrifice their protections in order to avoid the potential fallout of a terrorist attack, which I think is really come into stark relief over the last year and a half, where it's absolutely shocking that the two of the worst, most violent attacks we've seen in Canada that's inspired by hate have been against a mosque and against targeting women. The mosque in Quebec City and targeting women in Toronto, both inspired by far-right extremists. And meanwhile, we're continued to be told that the people we need to fear are Muslim people, are Arab people, are largely Black or brown people. And it really is, like you said, what's it going to take for people to stand up and say that this is just unacceptable? And I think, even though I wasn't one of them, I think there was a real belief that the Liberals would kind of roll that back, and that they would take the principled action that would need to be done to start rolling this back and to start making sure that our national security agencies aren't targeting particular communities. But we haven't seen that. Some argue that it's also because there's different particular ideas and methods that are entrenched in the security establishment. I don't know the security establishment well enough to know how much of it is that and how much of it is the politicians. It's definitely there, though. If we look at the lawsuit against CSIS last summer by some of their employees, alleging harassment and homophobia and Islamophobia from within the agency, there's no doubt that if that's how they act towards their own employees, then that's also the view that they hold of people who they're investigating. So there's still a lot of questions, but really I think you're right that it's absolutely shocking, but not shocking in that in the worst kind of way, that we're still targeting Muslim and Arab and people of color communities and not talking about the issues that are really posing the most threat of violence to people in Canada.
No, I agree with that. And I mean, I would say to those out there who are of the blue jersey as far as federal politics go, look at the money that these obvious disregards for process and equality end up in court for the government of Canada. Tim, do you think that Mr. Diab has a good case to get restitution from the Canadian government?
I think so. With these newest revelations, before there was the argument, no matter how flimsy it was, that the judge didn't have a choice. He was following Canadian law and that there was no breach of Canadian law. I think with these new revelations, even before I would have made the argument that there's a case for reparations and compensation. But I think with these new revelations, that certainly there needs to be a public inquiry and that, Hassan Diab and his family have been clear that they're not asking for financial compensation. He's never asked for that since he returned to Canada. Yeah. But really, if we look at what happened to him and these new revelations, for sure we need a public inquiry to understand the depths of it and to make sure it doesn't happen again. But also that he deserves, he and his family deserve some kind of restitution for what they've been through.
Now, as far as you're saying that it's going to take awareness, it's going to take people to start to take notice, and then the government will take notice of the people taking notice. Is there something new that's coming along for this case of Hassan Diab?
Yeah, so they've actually just launched a call for people to write to the Prime Minister asking him to initiate an independent and public inquiry into the case of Hassan Diab. People, if they go to Justice for Hassan Diab, it's HASSANDIAB.org. They'll be able to find information on a template letter and where to send it in order to ask the Prime Minister to start a public inquiry, because it is up to the Prime Minister to start this kind of inquiry. So we at the ICLMG, we've already written a letter. The Canadian Association of University Teachers, the Postal Workers Union, Amnesty International, and the BC Civil Liberties Association have all written letters so far asking the Prime Minister to initiate an independent inquiry. And it's really important for people to do this now, actually, because the government has initiated their own internal review of what happened in the Justice Department since these revelations, because they're very new. These recent revelations just came out last week. And they've said that they've initiated an internal review of the Justice Department. But it was the Justice Department officials that carried out these, questionable, so it's even worse, more than questionable, but these questionable acts in the first place. And it's important that we get the message out strong and clear that it can't be an internal inquiry, an internal review from the Justice Department, but really what we need is a full, independent, and public inquiry into what happened and to make recommendations on how to ensure that this never happens again.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with that. There needs to be a little heavier result than maybe a couple retirements and maybe an ADM or two getting shuffled to a new ministry. That's not going to cut it. I agree 100%. Next thing we want to talk about is a conference that's pretty much invading Toronto. RightsCon is in Toronto from May 16th to 18th. It's about the biggest thing of its kind I've ever seen on Canadian soil. How would you just describe it? Simple. I mean, I can't. The more I learn about it, the harder it is for me to describe. It's over 2,000 participants from more than 140 countries, over 250 sessions, with participation from over 700 governments, NGOs, and corporations. That's big.
It is big, and it should be very interesting. It will be very interesting, judging by the schedule that's out so far. I'd say it's really a conference looking at the intersection of where digital and human rights kind of intersect. So a lot of the underlying themes are exactly how in the changing kind of online and digital sphere, how does that affect human rights in Canada and internationally, and really does a good job. A lot of these sessions, I think, will do a good job to go beyond just the idea that, and it seems to be one that is pretty pervasive, that what happens online and on the internet is kind of limited to like just, it affects you on Facebook, it affects you on Twitter, it might be your email, but that isn't real life, And I think, if you think about it that way, I think a lot of people would laugh and say like, well, no, our online lives are our real life. You may have said that like 15 years ago, but really we live our lives online. But a lot of the discussion around human rights still, there still is a bit of a disconnect, and this conference really does a lot of work to try to bridge those gaps and look at how the real world and the very real impacts of digital and online laws and practices and activities affect, the rest of our lives. And I'm really interested. I still haven't been able to make my way through the whole schedule to decide what I'm going to go to, but we'll be there all next week at RightsCon, attending events, and we'll actually be doing our own event on Friday with a few other organizations.
We'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
But the way you described it, the conference itself is May 16th to 18th. But on May 15th, there will be a one-day event that will go towards drafting what is going to be called the Toronto Declaration. And it pretty much sums up what you were speaking to. And I'm going to quote the information that's out on the declaration. Machine learning has dramatic potential to improve lives, but as its use spreads across industries, products, and services, risks associated with the technology increase. The risk of unintended discrimination can arise in areas critical to the enjoyment of human rights, such as finance, health, policing, and criminal justice, and employment. Now, human rights are internationally recognized and enshrined in binding legal frameworks that protect people from discrimination. Over the last 70 years, UN bodies and regional and domestic courts have developed and elaborated on the application of the principle of non-discrimination to numerous contexts. As such, the international human rights framework can and should be the foundation for standards and principles of non-discrimination in machine learning. Now, they're using machine learning for basically anything that has to do with electronics or digital equipment. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And, just to put it in terms of the work that we do around national security and policing, something, that we should be paying attention to in machine learning is how more and more police agencies and law enforcement agencies are using what they're calling big data analytics to do predictive policing. So basically feeding information into databases based on algorithms to decide where to allocate policing resources and, in theory, how to reduce crime. But one of the big concerns that we, of course, have, and that experts on algorithms have brought up, and that is really kind of pointed to in here, is the fact that it's people making these algorithms. It's people deciding which information gets built into these data sets, and so there's no guarantee that the information going in isn't just as concerning or biased as what we already see in policing and things like that. And so there's really, machine learning, I think to a lot of people is still a vague term, but it has very real implications for how the more information is out there, the more data is out there that governments are using to try to craft policy and make decisions, whether it's on national security or on education or allocation of social services. It's new, and there's a lot of questions about how they're being applied and making sure that it's applied in a non-discriminatory way.
I mean, people should realize that, after the whole thing with SCL and Cambridge Analytica and et cetera, aggregate IQ in Victoria, the same methods will be applied across the spectrum, and governments will use them and law enforcement will use them. And if we can see the same sort of targeting and directive capability given to law enforcement, given to governments, people should be concerned that it's a level playing field, more or less, don't you think?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. There's definitely an underlying question, too, of the interaction between the public sphere and the private sphere, where the private sphere, they're doing this to make a profit.
Yeah.
And we've already seen, there were debates, especially, I don't think we're debating it as much now, but throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s, the debate on triple Ps, the public-private partnerships, where basically, we would get outsourced the management of prisons and hospitals to private companies at public cost. And there's just study after study about how horrendous those partnerships were, because they were developing public services, but based on a way to make a profit.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing now is that these digital services and digital programs, similar to how, working with Cambridge Analytica and SCL for, electoral purposes, but working with other such companies to develop software and collect information for other government services. There's still that underlying concern that we're entrusting kind of public services to for-profit companies instead of making the decisions based on what's good for the population.
That is dangerous, and it'd be nice to see what the final declaration is, because it in a way, I look at this almost like COP21 in Paris. This is the first declaration for what the international standards for equality with digital capability should be. So I think it's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as far as the session you will be involved in, I'm just going to read a little bit from what it says on the RightsCon website. Creating community capacity to respond to smart city initiatives to support data justice and human rights in a connected space. So it's right along the same lines. Mm-hmm. And Toronto is a very special place to do this. There's some advantages in Toronto, is there not? Mostly because of a company named Sidewalk Labs.
Yeah, no, it's Toronto is an especially good place to be talking about this right now, because they're living it as we speak. So it's great that we're actually doing this in Toronto. It would be relevant anywhere, but it takes on a particular relevancy in Toronto right now.
I know what they're doing there in Toronto, how they're trying to make basically an interactive neighborhood. And it is a big step forward, and I can just imagine the complexities to it, especially keeping everything straight and secure. But don't you think that if this is going to be done right, it's not going to appear to move too fast? Do you think that there is the appetite to take as long as it takes to get it right? Or will, quote unquote, capitalism start to rear its head and demand progress? Now, at this session, it's you. It's also Mark Sermon, who's an executive director at the Mozilla Foundation. There's Danielle Latour, founder and director of The Wise City. Jean-Noé Landry, the executive director of Open North. And Amira El-Gawabi, the digital communications rep from the Canadian Labour Congress. These are people who have a direct stake in what's being talked about here. Talking about digital rights, some equality, some prevention of abuse. What do you think the direction is going to be on this panel? I mean, are you guys going to get fired questions and then you have to respond, or is there a theme? Like the people you're there with, are there definite commonalities between your viewpoints and theirs?
Definitely. I think the commonality is that we all see the importance to center human rights to these conversations, and that when we're talking about how we're building neighborhoods and communities, and if we really want to improve them and make sure that there's better security for everyone, better services provided for everyone, that we need to be talking about human rights and non-discriminatory practices from the get-go. And there's a concern that these issues have not been at the forefront of these discussions, and that we need to talk about and really get into how do we make sure that smart cities are really in the service of the population, and that they're not in the service of private companies who are helping to develop and manage them. So that's really what binds us all together for this panel.
Well, the one line from the description of the session that I'll quote is, "It is vital to come together with an advocacy aim of defining the laws, policies, and conversations that need to happen now to ensure civic responsibilities are protected by the government and by residents." I mean, once you think about that, but yeah, this is a new way to live. That's the end goal of Sidewalk Toronto, is it not? It's a new way to live your life every day, and that's going to mean a whole new way behind the curtain too, right?
Yeah, and I think at the heart of it is that there is a crisis in a lot of cities around affordability of cities, of ensuring that there's an equal distribution of resources, of making sure that people are safe in their cities. And that does need to be addressed. But as you know, a few of us had a meeting the other day talking about the panel, and one of the things that came up is that there's that underlying question: is the way to achieve that really by collecting more data, or do we already know and have ways, to increase and ensure that we have more equitable and better service communities without having to always find a solution through, quote unquote, smarter cities or neighborhoods? So that there's that fundamental question that is still at the heart of it, because if that's the case, then do we need to be opening up to all these new questions about how do we protect our privacy rights, how do we protect from surveillance and things like that in these communities, if we don't actually need to be jumping on the bandwagon of using big data in order to create these new neighborhoods? So there's really that fundamental question about, sure, we all agree that there's things that we want to see improved in our cities. We can harness some technology to do that, but are we putting the cart before the horse in a way by saying, okay, the solution is by using more and more technology, of collecting more and more information, rather than stepping back and saying, these are the problems, what will be the best solution?
Yes, I agree. More is not always more.
No, and and one of the things that's come up is you mentioned about how long it would take, and so they are taking their time. I think it's a year or almost 2-year kind of process of consultation that they're engaging in. But the premise from the very beginning of these consultations isn't, we as Torontonians want to embark in a partnership with a firm, a data firm like Google or any firm, to develop a new neighborhood. Like, that should be the fundamental question. Is this the solution that we're looking for? But instead, what it is that the city has already agreed to a partnership in principle, an agreement in principle with Sidewalk Labs. They're going through this consultation process. We're being told that, by the end, we'll see what people want. And I think, there's a vague kind of idea that if people will then decide that we don't want to proceed with Sidewalk Labs and with Google, then it won't go forward. But I think the writing is pretty much on the wall that the idea of the consultation isn't about if it goes forward with them, but how it will go forward. And that's that's really at the crux of a lot of these questions, is that we need to be answering the if question before we're told that we're just kind of deciding how that this is going to happen. And that's when we get into questions about really what the impact on equality and on privacy rights and things like that will be in this new kind of smart neighborhood.
Well, that is going to be definitely interesting. I will be there to hear your session. That'll be Friday, May 18th. I believe it's, I'm not sure, 2:15 or 2:30 in the afternoon.
It is at 2:30 to 3:45.
There we go.
On the 18th. Yeah.
There we go. I will be there. It will be a thrill for me to meet about 4 past guests of The View Up Here. for the first time IRL. You, Tim, are one of them. I look forward to it, sir.
So do I. Yeah, I'm looking forward to meeting in person.
And that's where it ended. That's what you call an amateur edit at the very, very end. Well, it was a good discussion with Tim. We did cover exactly what we said we would. Now I'm going to fill some time here to talk a little more about RightsCon. I've mentioned it in a couple episodes now, but never been any background, really. Access Now is a organization that's centered in Toronto. They are bringing the 7th installment of RightsCon to Toronto. RightsCon Toronto will be the most important summit yet, with projections of over 2,000 active participants. This year's program will explore pressing issues, including innovation policy in Canada, free expression and protection of global journalism, gender diversity and digital inclusion, encryption and cybersecurity, and many other topics relevant to keeping the internet free, open, and secure worldwide. Since 2011, RightsCon has convened the global digital rights community in many power centers around the world. Not only is Toronto a dynamic tech hub in a country that stands counter to recent global trends of isolationism and exclusion, Americans, it's also one of the world's most diverse cities. I go on to their About from the website. More than an event, RightsCon is a global community with thousands of leading voices across stakeholder lines. It's a reminder of the existence of a powerful global digital rights community that is determined to defend human rights and keep the internet open and free. RightsCon's mission is to provide a platform for community members to effect real and positive change in the world through both traditional and innovative approaches. The event's programming is not only an arena of global, regional, and national policy debates, it's home to technologists creating new tools and advocates creating new campaigns. Conference programming is created by the participants, changes every year in response to emerging global issues, and has an explicit focus on driving tangible outcomes. Started in 2011 in Silicon Valley. Then it went to Rio de Janeiro in 2012. 2014 was back to the Valley. 2015 was in Manila, Philippines. 2016 was in San Francisco. 2017 was in Brussels. This year, Toronto gets to shine. I have made my personal schedule, which of course they have an app for. I'm going to be busy for 3 days. There's an amazing amount of things to see. And, I think on Thursday, I have 4 things that I wanted to see all at the same time. Oh, well. But to give you an idea of the caliber of people who are going to be on there, I'm just going to go through basically a highlight list. And it's true when they say they get leaders from all sectors. Steve Huffman, the CEO and co-founder of Reddit. Mitchell Baker, the chairwoman of Mozilla Foundation. Nigat Dad, the executive director of the Digital Rights Foundation. Steve Crown, vice president and general counsel for Microsoft. Nathaniel Gleicher, head of cyber security policy for Facebook. Michael Geist will be there from the U of Ottawa. international Canadian recognized for his work in this field. Matthew Prince, the CEO and co-founder of Cloudflare. Ron Dybert, Director of Citizen Lab. Daniel Terrien, the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. Cindy Cohn, the Executive Director of the EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation. Eileen Donahoe, Director of Global Affairs for Human Rights Watch. Thomas Drake, American whistleblower. Jesselyn Raddick, American espionage lawyer and whistleblower. Mariam Al-Kawalji, one of the leading voices from the Arab Spring in Bahrain. Mark Sermon, Executive Director, Mozilla. Teresa Swainhart, Senior Vice President of ICANN. There are people from every part of the digital world on each side. And there are 18 separate themes for all the sessions, everything under the sun. It should be rather interesting. I would certainly encourage you, if you're in the GTA area, and if you have the time, it may be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity with this many people at this point in time. There's going to be a lot of talk about nation, state, hacking, laws, lack of laws, counterinformation, propaganda, fake news, and then the whole other side about the rest of the world that's coming on to the internet all the time. And it is a revolution for them. So it's going to be interesting. That being said, the conference starts next Wednesday. So guess what? No show. I won't get home for another week after that. So guess what? No 2 shows. The View Up Here will return immediately before the Ontario election. And yeah, I don't know right now, but I'm willing to say, yeah, that's what the show will be about, the Ontario election. It's heating up. But the View Up Here will be going on the road, attending RightsCon Toronto as media. I intend to gather a lot of contacts and material. Maybe I'll come home with a couple episodes in the can. That would be cool. Otherwise, thanks for listening. We'll see you at the end of the month. Thanks for listening to The View Up Here. Good night.